You can wave. Ready? Okay, good morning. So this will be Nekudim-Tohu-Sheviras HaKeilim Part 2. So last week, I laid out, first of all, what is Tohu, or another name for it is Nekudim, because it's Nekudis, which we'll talk about more now. You know, right in the beginning of Chumash, it actually refers to it. Second pasuk after Bereshis bara Elokim, Shemaim v'Saaretz v'Aretz says Tohu v'Vohu, which refers to this world. So why would the Eibush B'chal make Tohu v'Vohu? Why can't he just jump to a Mesudadika world? V'cheshach al pnei hasehim v'ruach Elokim rachefes al pnei hamayim. So I'm going to talk more about that pasuk a bit, which we didn't really discuss last week. What I did discuss was, again, the role of it and the purpose of the Seisa Manas Livnes, which is that the Tohu is not an end in itself. It's part of the process of all development, that before you get into creating a full, harmonious, so to speak, an integrated organism, first you need the development of details. Like we discussed, using the example of a child, of the development of a fetus. So it begins with one cell, and this is all Abriya min hashamayim, this is not man-made. It begins with one cell, everything is included in there, like akudim b'klei echad, just as a dugma. Eser eris, like all the energies are bound together in one keli, and then the cell begins to split throughout the trimesters of pregnancy, and what happens? The actual child begins to develop breaks down into diverse and a multitude of many different parts and limbs and organs and cells and so on. So before the child actually is ready to be born, it takes 9 months. And that's part of the process. A logical process, the way the Eibishter made it was, first starts with a Nekuda Achas, then comes Pratim Ischalkus, and then after Ischalkus comes Iskalulus. Iskalulus will be primarily in the world of Tikkun. But Tohu, it's Ischalkus, and that's why it's called Nekudim, because it's like Nekudis Bifnei Atzmei, points. The points are separate. Sometimes the way it's described is that in Atzilus, the Esesphiris are in 3 kavim. You have Chochmah to the right and Bina to the left, and Das in the middle, Chesed to the right, Gvura to the left, and Teferes in the middle. And the same thing with Netzach, Chod, and Yesod, and then Malchus. And that essentially manifests in the human body. In the human body, we are also structured like that. There's a right, left, and a center. A right brain, a left brain, a center brain, a right arm, a left arm, and the heart in the middle. Same thing with the legs. In the Nekudim, on the other hand, Chassidus brings the whole Maimer from the Tzemach Tzedek, Vayemel Yenis and Machar Chedesh Maimer in Bereshis Eratera, the Alter Rebbe's Maimer with the Tzemach Tzedek's Hagos, and he explains there very beautifully and eloquently that Nekudim, by contrast, it's Nekudah Zeh Tachazeh. The spheres are not structured. They're just Chochmah, Bina, Das, in that order from Chochmah through Malchus. And that alone tells you it's not Iskalus. Because Iskalus means right, left, center. And the center creates the harmony. Like we know in the Mishkan. B'riach HaTichin, that's Bavriach min HaKotze LaKotze. That's like the middle, like the spine of the human body. God forbid, if a person didn't have a spine, would not be able to be a proper structure. Every structure needs at least 3 legs. A table can't stand on 2 legs. And there's dinim about it with sukkah and other things. So a structure needs 3. 4 is even better, but 3 is the main structure, right, left, and center. In Nekudim, in Tohu, everything is Zeh Tachazeh. So you can't call it a structure. It's more the points, but it's 10 spheres, yeah. So that's no longer like Akudim, 10 all bound in one kelim. Now we have 10 eris and 10 kelim. Like example would be the fetus. It's developed, but it's not yet viable because it's not yet fully developed to the point where it can really work together. A healthy human being consists of both elements. Total ischalkus, which means every organ and limb has its own particular role to play, but also total hiskalus, that interconnectivity that it all works together. So we'll be talking a lot more about it when we talk about tikkun Chassidus, but it appears at least to me, at least to my aniyas daiti. So there's a maimer called Al-Kein Yemer HaMeishlim Tafresh Tzadik Aleph from the Frierdiker Rebbe. It's quoted a number of times in the famous maimer Bostel Gani Tafshin Lamed Aleph from the Rebbe and other places, with the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, based on earlier maimorim, lays out and asks the big question. He says, how could it have been a chet etzadas? The world was created, Elam HaMiluyin, a perfect world. Odem HaChaver Yitzir Kapav Shal Kodesh Baruch Hu. How could there have been a chet etzadas? How is it even possible? There has to be a scenario where it's possible. And he goes into an explanation that nothing starts on its own. It evolved from the Miyot HaLavona that happened on day 4 of creation. And that in turn is a result of the Sheviras HaKeilim that happened in Tehu. And that's directly a result of the Tzimtzum Arishin. That's what he says there. Which in psychological terms, which I was using last week a lot, because I think it helps understand, first of all, Tehu and Tikkun very well, and also as a real application, is that it works like this. There's no problem that begins with a problem. It always begins on a small level. God forbid a person has a small infection. They don't deal with it. It begins to fester, and then it can grow into a monster. And you hear all illness, if you can catch it in the beginning, nip it in the bud, as they say, you can resolve the issues. So everything begins on a much more subtle level. It is Ezer Chacham Areis HaNeled that can look at something and diagnose right away and say, you better address it right now, because this can become a much bigger problem. Same as psychologically. The biggest problems you see never began that way. You know, when you see battles in, God forbid, in a domestic situation, shalom bayis, or parents and children or other things, it didn't begin with a battle. Somewhere something happened that was not addressed properly, or it was put under the carpet, meaning covered up, and that festered and festered, and it grew into something now we have to deal with a whole fire. It's like mamish like a fire. You know, a little spark, God forbid, lights a little fire. If you extinguish it right away, great. You don't, the fire starts spreading. And psychologically and emotionally and spiritually, it's the same thing. So what the Frierdiker Rebbe is explaining is that every chet, every problem begins with something that created a breeding ground. It's like a combustion chamber. The explosion doesn't happen. First you have the gas growing and toxins growing and accumulating, and then there comes like a volcano. It doesn't erupt overnight. It's years and years, who knows how many years, that the pressures build up and then it erupts. And the same thing is in every possible way. So in that context, then Tohu, as I explained last week, and I want to just repeat it because I think it's a critical component to understand it well, is Tohu is really, in a way, a market correction, so to speak. It's actually a reality check. Because after the Tzimtzum Arishin, a major distortion happened. Elikus is no longer b'pshittis. The hergish of Nivraim is that Elamus is b'pshittis and Elikus is b'yischachus. That's not a small shift. You know, it's like the famous story with the Chassid and the not Chassid debating whether God exists. They're back and forth, back and forth. You know, you could say a philosopher and a Chassid. And you know, obviously they don't get to any resolution. So finally the Chassid is already fed up. He says to him, you know, I envy you because you think about God all the time. To be honest, I think about myself all the time, or most of the time. Anyway, the philosopher thought he was what a compliment from such a big chassid. And he would go around proud, say, I got an endorsement from the chassid that I think about God all the time. Until he either got older and more mature, or somebody enlightened him that it was actually an insult. Because what the chassid was saying to him, you don't think about yourself because you know you exist. But the question is whether God exists. So you question, does God exist? Does God not exist? Why does he exist? So you think about God all the time. By a chassid, it's elikus b'pshittis. God for sure exists. He doesn't have to think about it. His question is, do I exist? Am I a dimion? Am I an illusion? Do I really exist? Why do I exist? What's my purpose? So it's not two different, it's not semantics, it's a completely different way of looking. Eined Molvade, from the eyes of Eined Molvade, Eined Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, in the Lashon of the Eitz Chaim, that we discussed weeks and weeks ago. There's no room for anything because all you have is Elikus. However you explain Elikus, but all it is one consciousness called Elikus, divine consciousness. The Tzimtzum is a concealment. Not from the point of view of the Eibishter. The Tzimtzum is not Mailam Chaz v'Sholem L'gabe L'mayla, but it's L'gabe L'makabel. Like a teacher doesn't lose his intelligence just because he's concealing it from the student. But from the student, right now, the student doesn't hear anything. It's silent. And it's only after the Kav, where the Eibishter begins to be Mamshech Ha'er, Kav Kotzer, Kav V'chut, that we begin to start understanding Elikus. But now what's changed is a fundamental shift, like thinking of turning the glove inside out. What does that mean? When you see a hand inside a glove, it's very clear. The hand is the ikir, the glove is just the lavush. But imagine someone says, the glove is the ikir and the hand is the lavush. Or the hand is the dovet tofel. That's why it's called klippus, that Shalor says. Why is it called klippa? Klippa doesn't seem like a negative thing. Klippa means a shell, a husk, like an eggshell, like a potato peel, an orange peel. So why is it called klippa? Because initially it's klippa shemer lepri. When you know that the whole purpose of the peel is only to protect the fruit inside, no problem. But as soon as you forget there's a fruit, and you think the peel is the ikir, which is basically someone living a materialistic life, and doesn't realize that all of it is really only emtsoi to the kol masech l'shem shamayim, called the checha de'eyu, kol ma shebara kosh baruch be'elam le'bara el l'chveidei. You forget about the chveidei, chaz v'shalom, so all you're left with is an outside peel. This is essentially how most people live their lives. I would say all of us live our lives. So the klippa part, why is it called klippa? Because when you make the ikir tofel and the tofel ikir. And some people even forget there's a fruit. So derech the moshel that the Rebbe brings from the Magid, famous sikha I mentioned many times, Tu B'Shvat Lamates, when the Rebbe was crying uncontrollably. The moshel of the father hiding from the child in order to elicit the ingenuity of the child to be able to find the father. That's a moshel for the tzimtzum. What problem is, the Helim is so good, the father is God knows how to hide himself well. And the child stops looking. And the Rebbe said, "Gezlunte gesucht, mante gesucht." And after a while, the child gives up. But the child isn't schuldig, the Rebbe says. But why not? Because the father concealed himself so well. The Eibishter is a good keich, just like he has a keich HaKeilim, he has a keich HaHelim. So really, all the problems become when the child gives up looking and he starts living his own life. And like this is regular life. I don't know who says there's a father or who says I have to look for the father. So all the problems began from a Helim that was kavanose gili. But the Helim becomes an Indian in itself. The klippa becomes, and that's on a lower level, of course, klippa. The Keilim become an end in itself instead of being a Keilim Te'ir. That's when the beginning of the root of the issues are. Toyu is a direct expression of that because Toyu is margish alakus. It's a divine world. Toyu is not created by us, it's created by the Eibishter. That matziv. So on one hand, the Eiris HaMerubim, it's margish alakus. On the other hand, it doesn't know how to deal with it because what's called a dissonance, a disparity, an imbalance between the Eir and the Keli, due to the Tzimtzum Arisha. So in Toyu is where it comes to expression that ultimately it will explode. Wherever there's an imbalance, ultimately it's going to explode. So is the explosion a good thing or a bad thing? The truth is, if you think about it, it's actually a good thing. Imagine a person has inside them tremendous conflict and tension, but they control themselves, they cover it up. They make believe it doesn't exist. Is that better? Or better that they should express it to somebody and say, here's my matzav, I'm in a very difficult situation. So most of us are trained, keep it to yourself and be quiet. But the truth is, anything that really is creating real tension, I'm not talking about if you can will it away and it disappears. We're talking about it always remains there. This is really all trauma and all real pain is in that place. The question is whether you're aware of it or you're not aware of it. So the explosion is actually an expression that there's something wrong. So in a way, Tohu-Sheviras HaKeilim is actually a statement that go do something about it. It's like, why are we in pain? No one likes pain, but pain is telling you, it's a red flag, it's like a red light telling you there's a problem. Why is there pain in the human body? Because something's not working properly. If we didn't feel pain, this doesn't need any doctor, but you ask anyone, if a person, for example, said, I'll numb my nerves, I won't feel pain, we'd be extremely dangerous. You wouldn't be able to feel your tongue, which means you can bite your tongue, and so on, and even worse things, because you wouldn't know that something's wrong. Pain is essentially telling you something's wrong, do something about it. So pain is actually a warning signal. It's like giving you a warning ahead of time to do something. So again, it's not inyan la'atzmei, it's seiser al manas livnes. It's telling you something's wrong, and now we need to fix it. So that is what summing up a bit more about Ichus, what I spoke about last week. I want to go now to the second thing that Tohu accomplishes. So you've probably heard this many times, and Chassidus brings it very often, from the Arizal. The big question, since Daimon Tzemeach Chai Medaber, the Medaber is superior to Chai, Tzemeach, and Daimon, so why are we dependent on lower species for our sustenance? We have to eat. Why the Eibush to make it that way? Why can't we just get sustained straight from Mokar HaChaim, from the Eibush himself? Our neshama should feed the body. Why do you need food? Which comes either from Daimon, Tzemeach, or Chai. So that Rizal explains, answers, because the higher the nitzutz is, the lower they fall. So even though Taka Daimon, Tzemeach, Chai are lower in Giluyim than a Medaber, because a Medaber obviously can dominate we have the power, we can control even animals that are a lot physically stronger than us. We're smarter, so we're a superior species. So in Giluyim, but in the Shadish, the Nitzutzis in Daimon is higher than the Nitzutzis in Tzemeach, and the Tzemeach is higher than in Chai, and in some way it's higher than the Nitzutzis of the Medaber. And he explains that means the Nitzutzis of Tohu. Tohu is where the root of Daimon, Tzemeach, Chai come from. And the way it's explained, and this is how Sheviras HaKeilim is explained, that Sheviras HaKeilim, physically, when you break containers, what happens? What happens to the broken shards of the keli? It scatters. Where did it scatter? Now here it's not begashmi, it's beruchnius. So it's scattered in this is the concept of what we call nitzutze kedusha. And specifically the Rapach nitzutze kedusha, 288. How do we know it's 288? Back to the pasuk in Bereshis, second pasuk. And that's understood because cheshech is a result of the tzimtzum. And in Tohu, it's manifesting that cheshech. Yes, on one hand there's oyed, but it's not mesudar, and it creates ultimately a shvira. And then he says, the mysterious line, what is that? You ask anyone who reads it the first time, pshat, it's like, besides the pasuk itself in general is a very mystical pasuk. But what's the Ruach Halikim Merachefes al Pnei Hamayim? And where is the Ruach Halikim before? The Eibush is not everywhere. What is this Ruach Halikim Merachefes al Pnei Hamayim? Says that Rizal that the word Merachefes is the letters Rapach Mes Merachefes, which is also a word. It means hovering, but it's made up of two words: Rapach 288 Mes that died, and he calls that the Sheviras HaKeilim. The second place there's a remes for Sheviras HaKeilim is the end of Pasha Vayishlach, where it talks about the Melachim of Esav, and it says Vayimlach Vayomos. It says it 6 times, and then the 7th time, Vayimlach Vayomos, and he says Vayimlach Vayomos is the Eris and Keilim of Tohu. The Vayimlach is the Ksorim, like Melech, and we'll talk about that in a moment, why it's called Ksorim, the Shviras of Tohu, and Vayomos is the Shvira. Now, I don't want to go into the details, but there's a longer discussion whether the Shvira happens on all Shviras from Chachma through Malchus, or as the Rebbe's father explains in the Kut Levi Yitzchak, and the Rebbe's discussed it a few times as well, that the real Shvira is in the lower levels. In the higher levels, it calls it a siluk. So there's a different effects, but regardless, something happened in all of Tohu. A disruption happened. The question is whether you can call it a misa, or you call it siluk, or you call it shvira. It's another discussion, not really so much for right now. just talking the general concept. So basically, v'ruach halakim merachefes al pnei hamayim means that even though there's cheshach al pnei hasahim, which means darkness, and there's a merachefes, which means that apach netzutzis have essentially, due to the shvira, have spread everywhere, but it's ruach halakim. There's still a ruach halakim there. It didn't disappear. So let me just explain it with a moshel. So I think can really capture it. In Ayin Beis, there's actually a few mashalim as well on this, but I'll use this moshel. Imagine somebody writes a book, a sefer, and then they start tearing up the pages and scatter them from, let's say, the roof of a building. And suddenly you have all over the place little pieces of paper. But then now, if you look at them, take any piece, it's not going to make any sense, because it's all like maybe a letter, a word at most. And then your mission, you're told, is to go gather them together and put back the puzzle together, piece them back together until you get the story of what that sefer or the book was saying. In other words, recreate the narrative which has now been scattered all over the place. So this is a moshel for what Sheviras HaKeilim accomplished. That it took the powerful divine energy in Tohu, which was, and the Keilim, and it created that the Keilim get shattered. The Keilim, remember, are also divine. They're not man-made, they're divine. And scattered it, and ultimately in the language of Kabbalah Chassidus, was nefel, v'yered, it fell in biyah. That's like the scattered pieces. And the mission of a neshama coming down lamata, and the Chassidus and neshama lamata, in this world, is each of us is allocated a certain amount of sparks, which the sparks are the sparks inside those little pieces, the little fragments, to gather them together, and that's what's called birur hanetzutzis. What does birur mean? In halacha, birur is to separate, or to clarify. But then we also have the expression birur, halah, zichuch. All these words are all coming to explain what our job is. And simply put, you and I, every one of us in this world, were given a certain amount of nitzutzik kedusha to elevate. Where are they? In everything you do. In the food you eat, like I mentioned, in the work you do, even when you walk down the street. So you have, on its own, if you don't do anything, it's just a piece, a fragment, that doesn't make sense necessarily. But if you use it l'shem shamayim, you eat l'shem shamayim, or you do anything that you're doing, Ma'asechel l'shem shamayim, or chol derchecha da'eyu, you're taking that little fragment and connecting it to its purpose. And ultimately connecting all the fragments of your life to one kavanah, to make a dira b'tachtenim. So you've actually collected everything that you've done in your life on a daily basis and directing it to the matara, the purpose for which it was created. If you don't do it chaz v'shalom, then it remains separate fragments, and that's what life is like, a fragmented life. A united life means, not that you don't have details, but the details are part of a larger story. What's the story? The story is the kavanah for which you were created. Now, b'chlolos is dira b'tachtenim, but b'pratis, each one of us has our particular shlichus. So each one of us is a different part of the world where we live, different type of keiches we have, different situations, different opportunities that come our way. So no person is alike, ein day saying Shabbos. So each of us have nitzutzik kedusha. Now, I know the question may arise, didn't the Rebbe say we already finished the birur on nitzutzis? It's a good question, which I'll discuss afterwards, because that comes later. I'm talking now throughout history. This has been the way we understand Avedas Adam. That's why you'll find Chassidus. What is Avedas Adam? Avedas HaBirurim. That's the Lashon. Or Birur HaNitzutzis, or Nitzutzik Kedusha. I mean, this language is everywhere. But sometimes we don't stop and think, what exactly does it mean? I mean, everyone has a general idea, but it's actually the Nitzutzis that fell from Tohu. So what that is, I was saying, Chassidus explanation, Barichis is, that's like you read it, Seirach Aliyah. In a Neshama in Gan Eden, whether in Bria or in Yetzirah, doesn't have this Aveda. Because there, Tohu did not have an impact. I should correct myself. It had an impact, but not quite the way it has in Elam Asiyah Gashmis. In this world is where the scattered and fragments that fell from the Sheviras HaKeilim, they come in this world. So when a neshama is in Gan Eden, it doesn't have this issue. Everything is very clear there. It's a question, what level of Elokus? But there's no idea of Pirud. I mean, it's Alma de Pruda, but it's not Pirud as we know it in this world. So when the neshama comes down below, so even though the neshama beguf, the medaber is higher than the tzemei chai, but in those things are sparks that when the neshama elevates that spark, it creates an aliyah in the neshama. Now the truth is, we all know neshama is rooted higher than tohu. Chelik elikam and mal mamish. But that's in Sheidah Sharshe. In Ishtalshalus, there's a mile, like when we say kol ha-yedid, kol ha-gavev, gavev b'yesir, nafal lamata mata yesir. The example Chassidus gives that a stone on top of a wall will fall farther than the stone in the middle of the wall or the bottom of the wall. So that applies to this concept, that the Sheviras HaKeilim, therefore, created this situation of these fragments. Now you could say, what's the mile in that? What exactly is the purpose of that? Well, going back to the point, the purpose of it is that, first of all, now we have a real Aveda to do. If Sheviras HaKeilim never happened, you would never really be able to go back to states Tzimtzum and pre-Tzimtzum, like I mentioned before. But more importantly, what Tohu explains is the Nefila Shalei Be'erech. When something falls, they say Nefil, a Nefila of Sheviras HaKeilim, it explains a big leap. If hypothetically you skip Tohu and it went from Akudim to Atzilus to Tikkun and to Bri Yitzir and Asiya, you would have a question, a philosophical question. How did a world like this become created where everything is fragmented and one thing is not connected to the other, Begolia at least? So you could say that Tzimtzum Arishan created a concealment, but who created the fragmentation? L'cheira, from Akudim, Okud B'klei Achad, Atzilus is Elikus, Bria is more of a Helam, Yitzir even more, Asiya. But Tohu comes to explain the leap Shalei Berach, that we can live in a world that literally feels like, when you think about it, is like a broken world. That's why we call it a broken world. A world broken, because it means it's made up of many different parts. And I've done many workshops on this topic, even with very secular people, and everyone responds to this. I say to people, make a list of everything you did today, till from the morning you woke up till at night, till you go to sleep. Make a list. And I give people some time, they make the list. It's usually around 100 items. Everything. You woke up, you pressed the snooze button, you got up and you exercised, took a shower, you had a coffee, a tea, then you read the newspaper. It doesn't make a difference what it is. Everybody has their own regimen. And then you list everything till at night. Then you went to work, you had an appointment meeting, a lot of wasted time, this thing and that. Everybody's got their stuff that they do. Leisure things, important things. And then at night, there's another say that everybody has the things they do at night. And then I say to the people, tell me, now connect a thread to all these items that you did today, and how many things are connected to one to the next? And across the board, most are not connected. What does that have to do? Tying your shoelaces in the morning with having a dinner at night with your family. No connection between that. And so suddenly people see a picture of their day, and you see how many different pieces there are. It's called disjointed pieces. That's what life looks like for most people. So people say, okay, so big thing, so what? So I do a lot of different things called multitasking. No, but there's an issue here. Imagine every day accumulate. One day after next day, week after week, month after month, year after year, century after century, it's a decade after decade, century after century. At some point, you have millions and millions of fragments in your life. Now, you may say, who cares? But you know something? Human beings, it's like there's an expression that nature abhors fragmentation. Like if you come into your house, or you come into a room, and the whole place is a churban, it disturbs us. We like Seder. Now, what Seder is very different for one person to another. I know people who have a desk that's filled till the ceiling with papers, and they think it's Seder. And when you ask them, how do you find anything? He says, tell me what you want. And I say, and they're able to pull out a paper, and they know how to do it in a way that the whole thing doesn't fall apart. Other people, you come, it's an empty desk, everything is filed. So in Seder, I understand there are different opinions. But everybody, a human being, like Seder, give a child, even a baby. I mean, a baby that's old enough to play a game, give them objects of different sizes, like circles, or squares, or rectangles, or triangles, And you'll see, they'll right away fit them into the holes. That's what children do. Because we naturally gravitate toward order. That's the nature of a human being. It doesn't need any chinuch for that. Chinuch can teach you how to create order among chaos. But order is something that we naturally gravitate to, and it creates calm and peace. And when there's chaos, it creates confusion, and we get overwhelmed, and we get disturbed. This is a rule across the board. So I'm just giving you a simple application. And then I tell the people, so now how do we create a thread that all the items of your day can be connected? That could only be if you have a purpose in life. If you know that your mission is to bring godliness into this world. Your mission is to be ish chesed. So then everything in the day, even the small things, in the morning or in the afternoon, in the evening, are all directed to that higher purpose. You're being asalim mikdash v'shachanti b'seicham. So all the details are becoming directed. And I could tell you right away, when people hear that for the first time, they're like almost amazed. Because nobody thinks that you can really create unity amidst fragmentation, or seder amidst chaos. But it's just another way of translating what the kavanah of Tohu is, with the matara that we have now. Now, to create such fragmentation can only come through a shvira. It could not come through a regular seder ishtalshlus. If you want something to be scattered and fragmented, you have to break it. There's no way. If you stood on a rooftop and threw down an object and it didn't break, it wouldn't break into parts. So it has to have some shvira in order for it to account for this, we'll call it quantum leap, from a state of achdus to a state of pirud. So even though on its own it's not a good thing, like I said last week, on Yom Sheni we don't say kiteiv, because begoli it's not teiv. It's ischalkus, it's machlekes, it's diversity which can lead to divisiveness. But on Yom Shlishi we say huchba bei kiteiv, because the kavanah of Yom Sheni is to get to Yom Shlishi shalom, to create shalom and harmony amidst this diversity and this fragmentation. So if you think about it, essentially the whole concept of birur hanetzutzos, or aveda sa'adam, that we go out in the world, and I'll use even the words of Esis of Shlichus, the Rebbe would bring the Lashon always, echad mehem gola lebarbaria, echad mehem lesarmatia. Then after Churban Beis HaMikdash, what happened? The Golas began. What was the main thing of Golas? Shepizron bein umas. We were spread all over the nations. You know, this way we lived in Eretz Yisrael. Yerushalayim was the Irabira, Aliyah L'Regel 3 times a year. There was a central headquarters, so to speak, a Sanhedrin. Everything was in place. A certain Achdus. Suddenly, Golas created Pirud. That suddenly, Pizron bein umas. But here's the Maimar Chazal, modern Maimar Chazal, seemingly. Tzedakah osa HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael shepizron bein umas. What kind of tzedakah is that? It's an einish. We say, Mipnei chateinu galinu ma'artzeinu. What kind of tzedakah? What's the tzedakah that Eibush to spread us across the nations? That's the whole goal. We want to go back there to Yisrael, Mashiach. What kind of tzedakah is it? So one of the biyurim Chassidus gives, the Mittler Rebbe explains it, and the Rebbe brings it quite often as well, is based on another Maimar Chazal, Lo higle Yisrael el lahesiv behem geidim. That the Jews didn't go into Golos only to increase geidim. But we also know geidim is kosher l'kisapachas. It's not something we go look for geidim. What does this mean? So the Mittler Rebbe explains, it's based on the Mittler Alter Rebbe's Maimorim. Geidim is referring to the Nitzutzik Dusha that are estranged. What's a geir? A geir is a stranger. Lamaila, the Nitzutzik Dusha are all in their place. But Lamata, through Duta Shviras HaKeilim, the Nitzutzik Dusha become geidim. They're estranged. They are displaced from where their original place is. And the kavanah of Golas is lahesiv am geidim, is to us to gather these Nitzutzik Dusha and elevate them. And that's the word tzedakah HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Golas is not the tzedakah. The pizron bein umas that were spread everywhere, like Shviras HaKeilim that created a spreading everywhere, is actually a bracha in disguise, because that allows us to go all over the world and ultimately gather the sparks and the Nitzutzik Dusha, or if you wish, the English term would be the spiritual opportunities that lie every place in the world. This is the essence, if you want, the Chassidish expression of what shlichus means. In Vayeshev Tovshinun Beis, the Sikha of Shabbos Pasha Vayeshev, the Rebbe uses this to explain why do we say we're closer to the Gula than ever. We're mamash on the threshold. So he says, because this is the first time in history that you have Eden everywhere in the world and doing the work of elevating the Nitzutzis in every part of the world. Till, for example, and just to explain the point a little more, and then you could also understand the Rebbe's whole beard of why the Nitzutz Birudim are finished, Avedis HaBirudim. So in Teira Eir, he asks a question. Oh, he doesn't put it as a question, but he answers this following question. If Adam and Chava had not eaten from Eitz Hadas, what would have happened? So Mashiach would have come. That would have been the Geula. So now we go thousands of years later. When the Geula comes now, so what did we achieve? They could have achieved it back then. What did we exactly accomplish over all these years? If the Geula could have come then. And the same could be asked throughout the history. Every time. Could have been Moshe Rabbeinu in the Midbar. Had done what they had to done. They would have gone straight to Eretz Yisrael and brought the Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi. Or it would have been the Beis HaMikdash HaNitzchi. Wouldn't be HaShlishi, it would have been the first, but it would have been Nitzchi. So the Alter Rebbe gives a very powerful mashal. He says, when Adam and Chava were placed in Gan Eden, also their kavanah was Avedis HaBirudim. However, you can do Birudim Mamayla Lamata, Mamata Lamayla. And he gives the mashal of an Avuka. Avuka is a big torch. If you have a very powerful torch, it will be Meshach. It will be draw the Nitzutz Kedusha to the torch. You don't have to go to each Nitzutz and elevate it. You make a very powerful light and everything is drawn to it. Had Adam and Chava done what they had to do, it would have been like a powerful torch and it would have been elevated the whole world. Basically, the entire universe, the entire earth, including Chatzei Kadar HaTacht, including Eretz Yisrael, including everywhere. They wouldn't have to actually go. Gan Eden is more or less estimated to be somewhere where today it would be southeastern Iraq. It was definitely not Eretz Yisrael, where the 4 Naharis are, not Pishin and Nachdekla, etc. So that would have been Meshach all the Nitzutz. Since they didn't do the job, so the Eibishter, what do you do when 2 people didn't finish the job or didn't accomplish the job? You break down the job to more people, their children. And now they have to go get the Nitzutzis. So the whole explanation of what's called transmigration, of generation after generation of people multiplying, and also migrating to other countries, was really the Eibishter's way of saying, okay, you can't do it Umay Lamata, so then go and travel. But in the beginning, it was still more or less be'erech around Gan Eden, that area. And then comes Avram, and he goes to Eretz Canaan, Eretz Yisrael. And this, the Rebbe explains, is the whole purpose when we always say the Frierdiker Rebbe came in Tafshin 82 years ago, and the Rebbe came 81 years ago to America. Chatzi Kadar HaTacht. What's the big thing, Chatzi Kadar HaTacht? And, we repeat this so many times over and over. The word is very straightforward. Chatzi Kadar HaTacht is the place, as the Frierdiker Rebbe writes in a letter explaining to the Rebbe, where Matan Torah did not happen. That's what the Alter Rebbe says. So the Rebbe asks the Frierdiker Rebbe, what does that mean? Matan Torah happened all over the world. It says, Tzipur Lev Tziftzif, the whole world was affected by it. So Frierdiker Rebbe writes in a letter, in the Igres, it's printed in Tov Ches, he writes the Echad L'Chesnov, it's to the Rebbe, that the word is Begoli, Matan Torah didn't happen. Chatzi Kadar Elyon is the hemisphere where Eretz Yisrael is, the same hemisphere where Europe is, and Russia, and most of Asia, or part of it at least. Chatzi Kadar HaTachten is what's called the New World, is America, the Americas, and Canada, and this part of the world. And that's what the Alter Rebbe is saying. But Goli didn't happen. When the Frierdiker Rebbe came to America, started a new Shlav, because now we still didn't bring Mashiach. So till now, we could have done the Avedim, Chatzi Kadar Elyon, and that would have been Meshach and draw the Nitzutzis of America and the lower Chatzi Kadar, including Australia, South Africa, whatever. But since that wasn't accomplished, so the same idea, so now people have to move, Eden had to move to America and make that the Merkez and the center of Chassidus and Torah and Chassidus to elevate the sparks Mamata Lamayla. So now the Chiddush is, as the Rebbe brings from Shari Eira, that the Chiddush is when you draw the Netzutzis Mamayla Lamata, it's a very powerful Aveda, but it's not Bepnimius. Because it's Mamay Lamata. It's not that every Nitzutz was actually elevated. It was drawn due to the great power from Lamayla. Now, when we do the Aved, it takes a lot longer, but it's a far more Primis Dika, because now the Birur is a Primis, because we actually go to each location. And the Rebbe explains it by the fact that we speak different languages, and we wear different clothing, and we follow the culture, as long as it's al pi halacha. In other words, we go and adapt to each culture in each part of the world, and what we're in effect doing is elevating that part mamata lamayla. And that's what he says in Vayeshev Tavshin and Beis is the Chiddush today. That we never did. To be able to say we're everywhere in the world, and every piece of the earth is covered. Now you may ask, 1 second, does that mean, what's that? We didn't, the earth have we walked on every piece of earth, and we've been in every part of the ocean? Obviously not. But the Rebbe qualifies that already. It says in Tanya that when they brought a minchas selis korban, it elevated the whole minat semeach. So it doesn't mean you have to actually go and elevate every apple and orange and mineral. You have to be in the general area and the klolos hamin, and that already elevates the rest of the min of that species. So I'm just putting a context a bit. This whole toyu and the way tikkun purpose of it is really understanding this whole idea of ruach halekim rechefes al pnei hamayim. Our avodah is to go into those apachnet tzutzes that were mess and actually be mechaya them. And how you mechaya them? By elevating them, by using them for the purpose they have to be used. Ki lo yalechem levade yichya adam, ki im ha-meitzi pi havai yichya adam. It's the spark. What's the meitzi pi havai? That's in the tzutz kedusha of toyu. That's in the lechem. And the same thing, lechem is Hashem klali for all food and all physical things, needs. So in your home, in mazon, levush, bayis, every detail of your life, there are those sparks that are embedded, or you could say even trapped, even held hostage. And that's why it's sometimes called pidyon shvuyim. We're redeeming the hostages, basically the divine sparks that are being held hostage in this material world. And you redeem it by freeing it, by elevating it and using it to Leshem Shamayim. That is the essence of really the role of Toyu in the whole picture. So essentially, ultimately, and we'll discuss this more when we talk about Tikkun next week, in the coming weeks, that ultimately the goal is that the Eiris Merubim and the Kelim Mu'atim of Toyu, which caused the Shvira, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment a bit more, should be redeemed and elevated. We are basically fixing the tikkun, the repair of the broken shards, of the broken pieces of these kelim as they fall into this physical world. And then when we do that, we can re-access the Eiris Merubim of Teyu, because once the kelim are rebuilt, then the Eir can return. Because remember, the Eir didn't disappear. It's just not, like I said with the book, when you tear up a page in a book, you can't read the content, so you don't see the Eir there. But there's Eir in each one of the letters. And when you piece it back together, the Eir will return. So let's say you take any idea and you tear it apart in pieces, so each piece has one little Eir in it that it doesn't really make sense until you put it together with others. Let's say you take the word Baruch and you break up Beis, Reish, Vav, Chaf. Okay, so here's a Beis, here's a Reish, here's a Vav, here's a Chaf. But when you piece it back together, it comes back to the word Baruch, the meaning of bracha. And the same thing with the bigger picture. So all the Eira El Al Kolona in the language of Chassidus, it's also brought in Ayin Beis in the beginning, comes back when we repair the containers. And one final point with the Eiris Merubim. So it obviously makes sense when you have very strong energy and you have very negligible or fragile containers, it's going to shatter. I mean, a simple example is that if there's a surge of electricity into a light bulb and there's no breaker or no filter or no regulator, it's going to blow the circuits, called shvira. And that's the truth in any type of thing. You put too much energy or water into a container, it'll break the container if it's going too fast or too powerful, too intense. Now, in Veda, the example for this would be kas, for example. When a person is overwhelmed by something and then they have an outburst of anger, it's also the Eiris are too strong for their kelim. It's not always Lamal Yusuf. Sometimes it could be. Even Zolgo Ein of Demois, when a person cries, there's also Eiris are stronger than the containers. So any form of called something being overwhelmed is like when you're inundating with something, it could always create a shvira. One of the examples that he uses, I don't think in Achrei Meis Tafresh Memtes, There he talks about Nodav and Avihu, of the Rotzeh without a Shuv. But there's a classic example of the Talmidei Rabbi Akiva, the 24,000 students that Lo Yinalgu Kavod Zeh B'zeh, the Gemara says in Yevomis, and therefore there was a Magefa, and they died during Sfiras Eimer. Until the end of the Magefa, like Ba'emer. Of course, the big question is, what can be Talmidei Rabbi Akiva? You're talking here Tanoim. You're talking here Rabbi Akiva who taught B'aftarecha Kamecha Gzer Klal Gadol B'Teira. How's it possible that they mamish the opposite of what they learned from their teacher? So one of the explanations given, the Rebbe speaks about it a lot, especially like B'Eimer Sichos, that it's Leinogel Kavod Zeh B'zeh due to their Maila, not due to their Chsad. Because each one was so intense in their way of learning, they couldn't tolerate the other. Like it says, Nichve b'chupaseh shel chaveri, Talmid Chacham. Sometimes you don't tolerate another person because the person is just not a nice person, is selfish. You could also not tolerate another because you're so intense and so passionate about your own opinion, and for good reasons. So Shem Shamayim, that you forget there's another person. So really, it's a perfect example for Eidos Deteyu. The Eidos Deteyu are Eidos of Elikus. They're Eid Eliki. It's not Klippah. It's not Le'umazeh. But however, the Eidos are not sensitive to the Keilim and not sensitive to each other. In Ayin Beis he explains that there's two main problems in Toyu. One is the intolerance of Chochmah to Bina and Bina to Das and so on, the Sfiras. And the second is the lack of Iskalus, that they don't work together. He brings there the whole thing with the two, the Yasheminim and Pirkei Avos, Amidas Daim. Shali, Shalach, Shalach. So according to the Tanakama, that's Midah Beininis. According to the Yasheminim, it's Midas Daim. Because it doesn't want to work together. You could say, what's the problem? What's yours is yours. Live and let live. No, live and let live is Hepech Teva Elam. The whole world has to work. Imagine all the organs in your body suddenly said, hey, Shali, Shalach, Shalach, I don't want to work together with you. You won't have a human being. You won't have anything that's healthy. So basically, it is the intolerance that comes from the intensity of Kedusha, which is why Rotzeh is not enough. You need a Shuv. You need Bittul. And that's what's lacking in Toyu, the ultimate Bittul. And because of that, the Eidos Merubim overwhelm each other, as well as overwhelm the Keilim, and that causes the Shvira. The mile of the Shvira I explained, but still we have to understand the root of it is again an imbalance, and the imbalance is due to the Tzimtzum Arisha. So ultimately the goal is going to be not just to have, in Tikkun then it says, it's Eidos Mu'atim, B'Keilim Merubim. Now the energies have become more tamed, they're not as intense, and the Keilim are much more expanded, so it works well. But the real Kavanah Chassidus explains, and the Rebbe brings it in Chav Ches Nissen, is that the Keilim, the Eidos Merubim, B'Keilim Merubim. It should be both. Eidos Deteyu and Keilim Detikun, B'Lashon Harav. Which is interesting. In other words, it's not just, okay, fine, two intense energies, so that's not good. We got to lower the energy. You lower the energy in order for the Keli to emerge. It's like a teacher comes down to the level of the student, doesn't overwhelm the student. But then the student's containers expand to the point that you can also be a Keli, not just to the Eidos Muatim, but also to the Eidos Merubim of Toyu. So you see, ultimately, it's not just in Tikkun, it's actually a Tikkun of Toyu. So Toyu will be rebuilt. We're not going to just have Tikkun. It will be the Chibur of Yichud of Toyu and Tikkun, as explained in some Maimorim, Teres Chaim, and other places. Or in another language, the Chibur and Yichud of Esav and Yaakov. Esav coming from Toyu and Yaakov from Tikkun. So we'll stop here. And I think I covered it. If there are any questions, I'll address it next week if there are any things to add. We'll stop here. Everyone have a good day. And be mechaber yoteyu and tikkun.